Hello, everyone, and welcome to Check This Out with Booming Encore. My name is Susan Williams, and I'm the founder of Booming Encore. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Travis Luther. Travis is the author of the book, Retirement on the Fun Side of the Wall, which explores some of the reasons why some people are making the choice to retire in Mexico. Welcome, Travis.
Hi, thanks for having me, Susan.
Well, first of all, Travis, I really enjoyed your book. And as
Thank
much as I thought the book was going to be around, people who actually retired in Mexico, I discovered it was more a perspective of society's views and approaches and current status of retirement as a whole. So what even caused you to actually write this book? I mean, you're not anywhere near retirement age, and typically we find a lot of the authors that are writing these books usually are.
Yeah, well, the book actually started as my thesis in sociology. I went to graduate school for sociology, and so about 10 years ago now, I had to come up with a topic. And at the time, I was an entrepreneur. I'm still an entrepreneur. And I was really interested in these digital nomads, people who had built these online businesses and were traveling all over the world, operating their businesses basically from their laptop. And I thought that sounded like a pretty exciting lifestyle. But that also kind of coincided with my having to do my sociology thesis. And so, really the question that was going over and over again in my mind was, why would anyone want to leave the United States? I grew up believing and being taught that the United States offered the best of everything, that we, we had the best education, the best economy, the best society, et cetera, et cetera. And so I was really curious about why people would leave the United States. And I was having some second guessing myself, I guess you could say, and as I explored the world and explored people outside of the United States and expats living outside the United States, I kind of came to realize I'd been naive for a really long time, which, someone with my ego, it's really hard to admit that. But and so I just got real curious, and I really dug into different expat communities all over the world. And then as my thesis deadline grew closer, I kind of narrowed in on these baby boomers who had found a new life down in Mexico. They were close and accessible. And so I took a trip down there, and I fell in love with the country, and I fell in love with the folks that had moved down there. And I decided to make that the topic of my thesis. Since that was published, there was just people asking all the time. Either they found the thesis online, or they found something about it and would reach out to me and want to know more. And I decided a couple of years ago, you know what, I think this is a topic that the public is probably more interested in than I thought, and decided to write a new book that covered the entire country of Mexico and looked at expats there all over the place.
Yeah, well, you certainly did a deep dive. And now, what were some of the major findings that you discovered about the people who actually retired to Mexico?
I think that my biggest finding probably was that, or the thing I didn't find was I expected to find a lot of broke baby boomers down there. I really thought that the financial recession from 2007 through 2009 was what was driving a lot of baby boomers to retire in Mexico. And so that was kind of my operating thesis, is that people who couldn't afford to live in the United States or retire in the United States, or people who couldn't afford to retire well in the United States, would choose Mexico as an affordable option. What I found was that people were choosing Mexico in some respects because it was affordable, but because they wanted to retire earlier. And so on average, they're retiring 5 or 6 years earlier than their US counterparts. But what really gets them to stay there are these authentic communities that they've been a part of. And so while money is something that they think about, the truth is that the people that end up in Mexico are actually better off than their US counterparts. They're actually upper income earners. They're highly educated, usually with a bachelor's degree. A good percentage of them have a PhD or professional degrees. So these weren't penny pinching, low income people like I expected to find. They were actually upper income people, super educated, who wanted to retire earlier, and who were kind of butting up against a retirement system in the United States that didn't provide them what I call in the book authentic community. It didn't allow them to direct kind of their retirement and live independently while living in a community of other retired folks. And so it's really this authentic community, which is a combination of both the local Mexican culture and Mexican community, as well as the scattering of expats within it, that they've come to love and that they refuse to leave.
I know, and I found it was quite interesting. You mentioned that a lot of them were actually what you would call intellectually curious. They wanted sort of a cultural change and wanted to learn new things sort of later in life. And that was also a bit of a motivator, which I thought was also quite interesting.
Yeah, I think people underappreciate how cognitive decline actually affects your physical health as well. And I know that, the government has looked at ways to improve health among seniors, and they talk about cognitive decline or cognitive stimulation. And so I also discovered that these folks were really, they were looking for that stimulation, right? They didn't want to just go to a retirement community or something like that and play the same games or see the same people over and over again. What they wanted was a real intellectual challenge, which included getting to know a new culture, getting to know a new language, a new geography, and in that their lives are really enriched.
And was there anything that really jumped out at you that you were quite surprised at? I mean, I know you mentioned sort of the financial, but and that, the fact that they weren't actually financially strapped necessarily, and that may have been an initial motivator, but in comparison to, some of the other people in the United States, they definitely were not what you would call what you actually called the penny pinchers. But was there
Right.
anything else that really jumped out at you that you were quite surprised about?
Yeah, the cool thing is I kind of have the hindsight of a 10-year study, even though the research for this book was redone and compiled over the last 2 years. I did an original project 10 years ago. And so what's been most surprising to me are two things. One, the speed in which retirement in Mexico has accelerated. When I did the original study, the people that I talked to, usually they knew somebody who was already there, or they had a family member or friend who was already there that would come down, put a toe in the water, check it out, see if they liked it. And those were the people I found. Now you fast forward 10 years, and there's almost a million, I think maybe a million baby boomer retirees in Mexico, and they're coming down sight unseen. They're taking advantage of the internet, travel websites, expat websites, and social media groups to get to know the country and to build kind of a network before they show up. So the rate in which they're arriving has really accelerated. And the second thing on top of that is the number of single women who are making the move to Mexico sight unseen, right? So in my original study, that wasn't really the case. It was generally married couples. And now 10 years later, with the acceleration of the internet and these expat sites and these move to Mexico sites, there are more single women than single men showing up down there, and they're doing just fine, and so that was really surprising too, especially with all the talk around safety. That's kind of counter to what we would think.
And just on that point, like, unfortunately, or we often see in the news, the issues around violence and drug situations in Mexico. Did you actually encounter that? Was safety really a concern?
Well, I always say that Mexico can be a dangerous place, and I know that people say, well, Chicago's dangerous and Washington D.C. is dangerous too, and I think the prevailing wisdom is you always, you just take a look around at where you're at and you be careful. But I do caution that there are parts of Mexico that are very dangerous, but they haven't been dangerous for expats or Americans. So you're still more likely to be shot as a U.S. citizen in Chicago, unfortunately, or New Orleans, unfortunately, than you are to be shot or killed in Mexico. You're definitely way more likely to die in a car accident. But we hear about it all the time because it's so unusual, and I think that's what people miss. Because it happens so rarely, we tend to hear about every single instance of it. And it's very similar to shark attacks. We hear about every shark attack, which sometimes leads us to believe that sharks are attacking people all the time, when the truth is it's actually very, very rare. So I think when I talked to expats in Mexico and asked them about safety, a majority of them thought that Mexico was safe or safer than the places that they had come to from the United States. And I think while myself and everyone down there acknowledges that there is violence and that parts of Mexico can be a dangerous place, in general, it's not dangerous for U.S. or Canadian expats. Unfortunately, it's dangerous for police officers and people in the drug trade, and also in specific areas that revolve around the drug trade. And so again, I think that's unfortunate, but it very rarely spills over into the expat communities.
And Travis, are there any specific lessons? Like, not everybody's going to be able to move to Mexico, but you actually discovered a number of different things that help people, better enjoy their retirement. So are there some lessons that could actually be applied wherever you live that you discovered when you were doing your research?
Yeah, I think, again, it goes back to this idea of like an authentic, supportive community. I think that people in the United States and Canada report being happier when they're in places where they're not actually fully taken care of. What people need to look for in retirement are relationships of reciprocity, which is what I found is really valuable to people, where they get opportunities to help others at the same time while they're helped. And so we kind of are starting to see the birth of shared living situations and people staying in their homes longer and having kind of this. There's a couple sites I refer to in the book, but almost like an Airbnb for seniors, if you will, where people are trying to think of ways to keep their independence longer, while relying on the help of each other, if you will, versus relying on the help of these retirement institutions that have basically come to take as much money from you as they can, right?
And I just have to ask the question. I mean, the title is quite cheeky, The Fun Side of the Wall. Do you want to just share where that actually came from?
Yeah, absolutely. So the original title, the working title for, I would say, almost up until 3 weeks before the book was published, was When the Buffalo Roam, Baby Boomer Retirement in Mexico. And that was kind of a reference to Home on the Range and this idea of Americans traveling south. But I went back for Day of the Dead last year, in October, November, and one of the guys I had interviewed for the book had invited us over for dinner. And he was sitting there talking about the Trump election and how people had reacted and stuff, and being a little bit nervous that there might be some animosity or bad feelings towards him because he was an American. And he said one of his Mexican friends walked up to him, put his arm around him, and said, "Don't worry about it. You're on the fun side of the wall. It's all." That's such a great thing to hear, and a great thing to have said to you, that I changed the title of the book to The Fun Side of the Wall.
Yeah, so here's the book, everybody. So if you get a chance, it's a great read. As I mentioned, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I found it quite informative, both on the people retiring to Mexico, but also on retirement as a whole, as you did the comparison to, the people retiring in Mexico compared to the people that are actually remaining retired in the States, and sort of some of the demographics and the statistics around that. So that was really interesting. So thank you so much for your time, Travis. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Susan. I really appreciate you having me.
It was a pleasure. And to everybody out there, hope you found this information valuable and helps you live your best booming encore. Bye for now, everyone.